Welcome back to our series. Today, we explore the beginning of the journey of Shah Faisal, the man who shaped the modern Middle East. The desert wind whispered across the sands of Najd, carrying with it the scent of dust, fire, and destiny. It was 1906, a time when Arabia was still divided, a land of scattered tribes, bound by faith but separated by loyalty. And in a modest house in Riyadh, a child was born who would one day rise to guide this land through storms of change. His name was Faisal bin Abdulaziz al-Saud, the son of a warrior, the grandson of a reformer, and the heir to a dream that would transform the Arab world forever. The young Faisal's world was not one of palaces and wealth. It was a world of heat, endurance, and survival. The morning call to prayer echoed through the small mud-brick homes, and life began with simplicity. Men rose to tend their flocks, women gathered water, and children learned discipline early. From the very beginning, Faisal's father, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, taught him that leadership was not inherited, it was earned through patience, wisdom, and service to the people. Abdulaziz was a visionary. He dreamed of uniting the tribes of Arabia, of ending the cycles of blood and revenge that had ruled the desert for centuries. He fought not for land, but for purpose, for the rebirth of an Arab identity rooted in faith and justice. As his son watched from the shadows of tents and battlefields, Faisal began to understand the true meaning of power. It wasn't the sword that made a ruler great, it was restraint, mercy, and understanding. From his mother, Tarfa bint Abdullah al-Sheikh, Faisal inherited spiritual depth and humility. She was the descendant of the great scholar Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, the man whose teachings shaped the religious core of Arabia. Her calm nature and unwavering faith left a permanent mark on her son's heart. Where others saw chaos, Faisal saw divine order. Where others sought glory, he sought purpose. As a child, Faisal preferred silence over chatter. He observed, absorbed, and learned. When tribal leaders visited his father, he stood quietly in the corner, listening to every word exchanged, words of loyalty, strategy, and betrayal. One evening, when a guest questioned Ibn Saud's vision of unity, young Faisal spoke for the first time. "A leader's word," he said, "is like the wind. You cannot see it, but you can feel its strength when it moves the desert." The tent fell silent. Ibn Saud smiled, the boy was already his father's son. Faisal's education was not confined to books. His classroom was the desert itself, vast, merciless, and eternal. Under the scorching sun, he learned endurance. Riding for days across dunes, he learned patience. Watching tribes clash and reconcile, he learned diplomacy. In every grain of sand, he saw lessons of resilience. And in the endless horizon, he began to understand destiny, not as a gift, but as a responsibility. When he was barely a teenager, the world around him began to shift. In 1914, the First World War erupted, and the Ottoman Empire, the ancient ruler of Arabia, began to crumble. The British and French sought to divide its remains, and Arabia became a stage for their ambitions. Ibn Saud, wise and cautious, navigated these dangerous waters with precision. He dealt with empires but remained loyal to his people. And by his side, always listening, always watching, was his young son Faisal. Faisal quickly grasped what many older men did not, that the real power of the coming age would not be measured in swords or horses, but in ideas, alliances, and faith. He began to assist his father in diplomatic matters, often acting as his envoy in tribal disputes. Even the elders respected his calm judgment and sharp mind. He spoke little, but every word he said carried the weight of conviction. Then, in 1919, something extraordinary happened. Ibn Saud decided to send the 13-year-old Faisal as his representative to London, the heart of the British Empire. It was a bold move, almost unthinkable. But Abdulaziz knew his son's potential. He wanted the world to see the future of Arabia in Faisal's eyes. The journey was long and strange. From the blazing sands of Najd to the grey skies of London, it was as if he had traveled between two different worlds. For the first time, Faisal saw towering buildings, trains that roared like thunder, and ships that seemed to defy the will of the sea. Yet even among such wonders, he carried himself with dignity. When he met King George V, he stood tall and calm, his traditional white robes flowing like the desert wind. The English courtiers whispered in awe. The boy's presence was regal, his gaze steady and knowing. He did not fumble with words. When asked about his homeland, he said softly, "We have little, but what we have is pure. We live by the truth of faith, not the shadow of gold." The newspapers wrote about him for days. The young prince from the sands, they called him. But to Faisal, it was not about fame, it was about understanding. He saw how powerful nations moved, how they negotiated, how they disguised ambition with diplomacy. He learned that alliances could be as dangerous as wars. And when he returned to Arabia, he was no longer a boy, he was a diplomat, a thinker, and a strategist. As the 1920s unfolded, Faisal took on more responsibility. He negotiated peace among tribes, represented his father in foreign meetings, and even helped shape the policies of the growing Saudi state. His calm demeanor and sense of fairness made him a respected figure among rivals and allies alike. Even those who opposed Ibn Saud admitted that his son possessed rare wisdom for his age. By 1932, when the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was officially founded, Faisal stood beside his father at the birth of a new nation. The boy who had once sat silently in the corner of dusty tents now stood at the dawn of a kingdom, the unifier's son, the observer turned leader. That night, under the vast Arabian sky, Faisal looked out over the land his father had united. The fires of camp settlements flickered in the distance. The stars above shimmered like the promises of a divine future. In that silence, Faisal made a vow to himself, that the kingdom his father had built with the sword, he would preserve with wisdom. He knew the battles ahead would not be fought in deserts or valleys but in embassies, oil fields, and the corridors of foreign power. He would face kings, presidents, and empires, but his faith would remain his compass. The story of Shah Faisal had begun, not in a throne room, but in the dust of the desert. A prince shaped by struggle, destined for greatness. And though he didn't yet know it, the choices he would make in the years to come would forever change the destiny of Arabia, and the world beyond it. In Part 1, we witnessed the birth of a leader, the young Faisal bin Abdulaziz al-Saud, son of the unifier of Arabia. In this chapter, we journey deeper into his transformation, from a prince of the desert into a statesman of destiny. The year was 1932. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had just been proclaimed, a dream carved from endless deserts and united tribes. For centuries, this land had been a mosaic of rival clans and faith-driven warriors. Now, under the leadership of Abdulaziz ibn Saud, it stood as a single nation, strong in faith and bound by a new purpose. Prince Faisal, still in his 20s, was already emerging as one of the most capable men in his father's court. His experiences abroad had given him a broader vision than most. He had seen the power of empires, the reach of technology, and the influence of diplomacy. His father recognized this gift and entrusted him with a task that would define his early political life, to represent the kingdom on the international stage. At that time, the world was rapidly changing. The Great Depression had shattered economies, European powers were tightening their grip on colonies, and the winds of World War II were beginning to stir. In the midst of this turmoil, Arabia was rich in faith but poor in resources. Oil had not yet been fully developed, and the nation's survival depended on wisdom more than wealth. King Abdulaziz knew that to secure his kingdom's future, he needed alliances, not wars. And for that, he needed someone who could speak to the world in the language of both faith and reason. Faisal was that man. His first great test came in the mid-1930s, when he was appointed as foreign minister, the first in the newly formed kingdom's history. His job was to build bridges with the outside world while protecting the nation's independence. It was no easy task. The British and French, who still controlled much of the region, were wary of the Saudis' growing influence. The neighboring Hashemites, in Jordan and Iraq, viewed the Saudi state as a rival. Faisal approached every challenge with calm intellect. He believed diplomacy was an extension of faith, that honesty and patience could achieve what armies could not. In meetings with foreign envoys, he was courteous but firm. When pressured to compromise his country's sovereignty, he would simply say, "Our kingdom was built by our own hands, under God's guidance. We will not trade its honor for favors." In 1939, the world changed forever. War erupted again, the Second World War. The flames of conflict spread across continents, and once again, Arabia found itself caught between great powers. Britain wanted Saudi Arabia's support against the Axis sought to win influence through promises of independence and wealth. Faisal's father, the wise Ibn Saud, remained neutral, but neutrality required skill. Faisal became his voice in the storm. When the British envoy came to Riyadh asking for military bases, Faisal responded with grace. "Our friendship is sincere," he said, "but our loyalty is to peace. We do not wish to bring the fire of war into our land." Even during those turbulent years, Faisal saw opportunities where others saw only chaos. He realized that the world's hunger for energy would one day change everything. The early oil discoveries in Dhahran hinted at immense potential. Western companies were eager to invest, and Faisal was tasked with ensuring that Saudi interests were never overlooked. He approached the negotiations with rare foresight. While many leaders of the time surrendered control to foreign powers, Faisal insisted on partnership, not exploitation. He believed that Saudi Arabia's natural resources were a divine trust, not a tool for greed. "Oil," he once said, "is like blood in the veins of the land. It must flow for the good of the people, not for the benefit of strangers." By the 1940s, Faisal had earned the respect of foreign leaders and the admiration of his people. When his father's health began to decline, Faisal's responsibilities grew even greater. He often acted as regent, making key decisions on domestic and international matters. His leadership was marked by balance. He valued progress but refused to compromise the kingdom's Islamic identity. His visits abroad during this period were legendary. In 1943, he traveled to the United States at the invitation of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The meeting was a milestone, the first direct contact between Saudi Arabia and the United States at such a high level. Faisal's composure impressed American officials. They expected a desert prince but met a disciplined diplomat with deep understanding of global politics. He spoke of his nation's vision, of unity and stability in the Middle East. When questioned about modernization, he replied calmly, "We will welcome progress, but not at the cost of our values. We seek knowledge that strengthens, not corrupts." Roosevelt admired him, noting his wisdom and restraint. That meeting would lay the foundation for decades of Saudi-American relations, a partnership that would reshape the modern world. When King Abdulaziz passed away in 1953, the kingdom entered a new era. Faisal's elder brother, King Saud, ascended the throne, while Faisal became crown prince and retained his role as foreign minister. It was a time of hope, but also of challenges. The nation was growing fast, oil revenues were rising, cities were expanding, and foreign influences were increasing. But beneath the surface, tensions between the two brothers began to build. King Saud loved grandeur, palaces, luxury, and displays of power. Faisal, in contrast, lived simply. He believed in discipline, transparency, and service. While Saud spent lavishly, Faisal urged restraint. He warned that wealth, if not used wisely, could destroy the spirit of unity their father had built. In one meeting with tribal leaders, Faisal spoke words that would echo through history: "The strength of a kingdom is not in gold, but in justice. When justice weakens, no fortress can stand." Over time, his warnings proved true. Financial mismanagement, political disagreements, and external pressures began to shake the kingdom. Faisal, seeing the danger, reluctantly stepped into a larger role, not for ambition, but for duty. He began to take charge of key state matters to stabilize the situation. By the late 1950s, the world around Saudi Arabia was in upheaval. Arab nationalism was rising under Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, whose fiery speeches about unity and revolution inspired millions. Nasser sought to challenge monarchies and replace them with secular republics. Many Arab kings feared him, and for good reason. His influence reached deep into the heart of Arabia. But Faisal was not easily swayed by propaganda. He respected Nasser's passion for Arab unity but disagreed with his methods. "Unity," Faisal said, "must come from the heart, not the barrel of a gun." He began to shape Saudi Arabia's foreign policy around moderation and stability, offering financial aid to struggling Arab states while promoting religious solidarity through Islam. He believed the kingdom's true power lay not in its wealth or army, but in its spiritual leadership as the guardian of the two holy mosques. If we lose our values, he said, we lose ourselves. Meanwhile, at home, Faisal quietly began reforming the state's institutions. He modernized education, introduced administrative systems, and encouraged the training of Saudi youth in science and technology, all while preserving Islamic teachings. His dream was not to westernize Saudi Arabia, but to modernize it on its own terms. Then came a turning point. In 1964, amid growing instability, the royal family and religious scholars agreed that King Saud should step down. The nation needed a steady hand, and all eyes turned to Faisal. He accepted the responsibility with humility, saying, I take this position not for power, but to serve God, the King of Kings. That day, the quiet prince of the desert became King Faisal bin Abdulaziz al Saud, the ruler of Saudi Arabia, and one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century. But this was only the beginning. The world would soon test him like never before. Wars, revolutions, and oil crises would all converge on his reign. Yet through it all, he would remain steadfast, guided by faith and vision. In the next part, we'll witness how King Faisal transformed his kingdom into a modern state, faced global powers with unshakable courage, and stood up for justice, even when the entire world stood against him. In Part 2, we saw Faisal rise from a prince to a statesman, from a diplomat of vision to the throne of Saudi Arabia itself. But as he took on the mantle of leadership, the world around him was burning with change, and his destiny was about to be tested in ways no one could imagine. The year was 1964. When Faisal became king of Saudi Arabia, the kingdom was fragile. Years of mismanagement under King Saud had left the economy struggling, the government divided, and the people uncertain. Faisal's first act as king was not a speech of triumph, but a promise of duty. He told the nation, we will reform our house with patience and faith. We will serve the people as servants of God, not rulers of power. He began immediately to rebuild from within. One of his earliest reforms was to bring order to the finances of the state. Under Saud, spending had spiraled out of control. Faisal introduced strict budgeting, cutting unnecessary luxuries even within the royal family. When ministers complained about reduced allowances, he replied calmly, if we are to lead by example, our comfort cannot come before our people's welfare. Every decision he made reflected his deep belief in accountability. He transformed ministries into structured institutions, set up financial audits, and demanded transparency. Even his personal lifestyle became a symbol of integrity. The king lived modestly, ate simple meals, and often walked without guards among his people. His humility won him the love of the poor and the respect of the scholars. But the challenges he faced were not just internal. The 1960s were a decade of revolution across the Arab world. Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser was spreading the fire of Arab nationalism, calling for the end of monarchies and the rise of secular unity. His voice echoed through radios across the Middle East, and many young Saudis listened with admiration. Nasser portrayed kings as relics of the past, symbols of oppression and foreign influence. Faisal understood the danger. He did not respond with anger but with strategy. He knew that fighting ideology required more than weapons, it required faith, education, and purpose. He began promoting a different vision for the Arab world, one rooted in Islam rather than nationalism. Our unity, he said, must not come from hatred or bloodshed. It must come from faith in God and justice among men. This belief shaped his foreign policy. He reached out to Arab and Muslim nations not through force, but through cooperation and aid. Saudi Arabia began supporting Islamic education abroad, funding mosques, and offering financial assistance to struggling states, all to strengthen a shared identity of faith. Yet his greatest test came when regional conflicts reached Saudi Arabia's doorstep. In 1962, even before he became king, a revolution had erupted in neighboring Yemen. Nasser's Egypt supported the Republican rebels, while Faisal's Saudi Arabia backed the monarchy. What began as a local conflict quickly turned into a proxy war between Cairo and Riyadh. When Faisal ascended the throne, the war was draining Saudi resources and fueling instability. He faced a difficult choice: continue the costly conflict or seek peace with his rival, Nasser. His advisors urged him to fight harder. But Faisal saw further. Wars, he said, are easy to begin but hard to end. The blood of Muslims should not be spilled for pride. He quietly reached out to Egypt through back channels, proposing dialogue instead of destruction. Years later, this approach would lead to peace between the two powers, a move that would change the balance of the entire Arab world. While Faisal focused on foreign policy, he also knew his people needed something more than stability; they needed progress. He envisioned a modern Saudi Arabia built on education, science, and faith combined. He opened schools for both boys and girls, a move that shocked conservatives at the time. When some clerics opposed girls' education, Faisal invited them to his palace and said gently, "I am not ordering something forbidden. I am only asking that our daughters learn what God has made lawful: reading, writing, and understanding." His courage in balancing tradition and progress was remarkable. He modernized the educational system but ensured that Islamic studies remained central. He invited foreign teachers, built universities, and offered scholarships for Saudi students to study abroad. His message was clear: we will take knowledge from the world, but our foundation will always be faith. The world began to notice. Under Faisal's rule, Saudi Arabia was no longer a quiet desert kingdom; it was becoming a decisive voice in global politics. Oil, once seen as a resource for others to exploit, was now becoming a weapon of power. Faisal saw what few others did: that energy would shape the modern age. He strengthened Saudi control over its oil resources and played a key role in the expansion of OPEC, Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. But Faisal's influence was not only economic. It was moral. He stood firmly for justice, particularly for the Palestinian people. In every international meeting, he raised his voice for their cause. "How can there be peace," he said, "when a nation is robbed of its home and its rights?" His passion for Palestine earned him admiration across the Arab world, but it also brought him into direct conflict with Western powers, especially the United States, which supported Israel. Yet Faisal's diplomacy was not fueled by hatred. He often said, "We do not reject the West. We reject injustice." He developed a reputation for being calm yet unyielding. In 1967, when the Six-Day War broke out and Israel defeated Arab forces, Faisal was heartbroken. He saw the defeat not as a failure of armies, but of unity. "We were divided," he said quietly. "When Muslims forget their brotherhood, they lose their strength." After that, he began preparing for a moment that would define him in history: the oil embargo of 1973. But before that storm, he focused on building his kingdom's foundations. He expanded healthcare, introduced modern infrastructure, and strengthened the armed forces. Still, he never lost sight of faith. He personally led prayers, attended religious discussions, and often began government meetings with Quranic recitation. His personal life remained humble. He refused to indulge in luxury. When offered a lavish palace renovation, he declined, saying, "The marble in these halls will not save me before God. What will save me is justice." But even as Faisal built a nation, shadows were forming around him. Within his own family, not everyone supported his strict reforms. Some saw him as too conservative, others as too idealistic. Yet Faisal stayed true to his vision, a vision where Islam guided progress and justice protected power. In foreign relations, his balance was masterful. He maintained cautious ties with the West while strengthening bonds with the Muslim world. He helped establish the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, in 1969, an alliance meant to unite Muslim countries in development and solidarity. This was not just politics to Faisal, it was destiny. He wanted the Muslim world to stand with dignity, free from colonial dependence and internal division. When asked why he spent so much of his life in service, Faisal once said, "Power is not a crown. It is a trust from God. And every trust will be questioned on the day of judgment." By the early 1970s, Faisal's reforms were transforming Saudi Arabia into a modern yet devout state. But as he gained strength at home, the world was approaching a new kind of conflict, one not fought with guns or armies, but with oil and influence. In Part 4, we will witness how King Faisal faced the greatest test of his leadership, the oil embargo of 1973, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the moment he challenged the world's most powerful nations with faith as his weapon and justice as his cause. It would be the defining chapter of his reign, and of modern Middle Eastern history. In Part 3, we witnessed King Faisal rebuild a nation from the ashes of mismanagement, uniting faith with progress, and strength with humility. But now, the world was about to change forever. A storm was coming, one that would place Saudi Arabia at the center of global power and test the courage of King Faisal like never before. The year was 1973. Across the Arab world, tension was rising once again. The memory of the 1967 defeat in the Six-Day War still haunted the nations of the Middle East. Israel had grown stronger, backed firmly by the United States and its allies, while the Arab nations were divided, politically, militarily, and spiritually. But deep within the desert kingdom of Saudi Arabia, one man was quietly preparing for the moment that would shift the balance of global power. King Faisal had always believed that justice was not achieved through war alone but through moral strength. He often said, "We may not have armies like others, but we have something they depend on, oil." In those days, oil was the lifeblood of the modern world. Every plane, ship, and factory ran on it. The United States, Europe, and much of the industrial world relied heavily on the oil that flowed from the lands of Arabia. Faisal understood this truth better than anyone. He saw that oil was more than a resource, it was a tool of destiny. For years, Western companies had controlled much of the oil trade, taking huge profits while paying little to the producing nations. Faisal quietly worked to change that, ensuring that Saudi Arabia gained fair control and a rightful share of its wealth. But now, that wealth would become a weapon of principle. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel, beginning what became known as the Yom Kippur War. As Israeli forces pushed back with American support, the Arab nations once again faced humiliation. The streets of Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad filled with anger. The people demanded justice. They demanded unity. Faisal watched closely. He was no warmonger, but he could no longer stand by while Muslim lands were occupied and the Palestinian people continued to suffer. He believed that words alone could not wake the conscience of the world, action was needed. So, when U.S. President Richard Nixon announced that America would fully support Israel with weapons and supplies, Faisal made a historic decision that would shake the world's economy to its core. On October 17, 1973, King Faisal and the other Arab oil-producing nations decided to cut off oil supplies to countries supporting Israel. This was the oil embargo, one of the boldest political moves in modern history. Faisal's message was clear: if our oil is the source of strength for others to harm us, then we will use it to defend justice. The world was stunned. Almost overnight, oil prices quadrupled. Gas stations in America and Europe ran dry. Long lines of cars stretched for miles as people waited for fuel. Governments panicked. Western economies began to tremble. For the first time, the world realized that the power of the desert could reach the heart of the industrial world. When journalists asked Faisal why he had done it, he calmly replied, "We have no quarrel with any people. But when our brothers are oppressed, we must stand with them. The West will not understand our pain until they feel our struggle." But this was not an act of revenge. Faisal's embargo was designed to awaken the world's conscience. He wanted peace, but not at the price of dignity. He sent messages through diplomatic channels, saying that if Israel withdrew from the occupied lands and recognized Palestinian rights, the oil would flow again. Meanwhile, his decision inspired millions across the Arab and Muslim worlds. For the first time in decades, they saw a leader who could challenge the great powers not with weapons, but with wisdom and courage. Faisal became a symbol of pride, the voice of a people long silenced by colonialism and division. The embargo reshaped global politics. Western nations began to reconsider their policies in the Middle East. The United States, under immense pressure, called for peace talks. The Arab nations, once divided, found new unity in their shared power. But Faisal's strength was not in oil alone. It was in his character. Even at the height of this global crisis, he remained humble and faithful. When asked how he felt about controlling the world's energy, he smiled softly and said, "It is not our control. It is God's blessing. And we must use it for justice, not pride." As the embargo continued, Western leaders rushed to meet him. Some tried persuasion, others offered deals. American diplomats urged him to end the crisis, warning that it could damage relations. But Faisal remained firm. He told them, "I am a servant of God before I am a king. As long as my brothers in Palestine suffer, I will not change my stand." In one famous moment, when U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger visited Riyadh to negotiate, Faisal received him with calm dignity. Kissinger asked when the oil embargo would end. Faisal replied, "When justice returns to the land of Palestine." Kissinger later admitted that he had never met a leader with such quiet strength, a man who commanded power not through fear, but through faith. The embargo eventually came to an end in March 1974, after partial progress in peace talks. But by then, the world had changed forever. Oil was no longer cheap or easily taken. The nations of the Middle East had discovered their influence, and Saudi Arabia had emerged as the leader among them, thanks to the courage and vision of one man. In the aftermath, Faisal did not celebrate victory. He returned his focus to building his nation. The vast new oil revenues were used not for luxury, but for development. Schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects spread across the kingdom. He established institutions for research, education, and Islamic outreach, believing that true strength came not from wealth, but from knowledge and unity. At the same time, Faisal continued his efforts to unite the Muslim world. He hosted conferences of Islamic scholars, encouraged cultural exchange, and pushed for cooperation in science and economics among Muslim nations. He believed deeply that the world's Muslims could lead in knowledge and morality, if they stood together under the banner of faith. Despite his success, Faisal was aware that not everyone supported his vision. Some within the royal family felt he was too strict, others too religious. His policies of austerity and reform created enemies among those who longed for the old ways of privilege and excess. But Faisal paid little attention to politics of the court. His focus remained on God and the nation. He often said, "The power of a ruler ends at his grave. But the power of justice endures beyond time." By 1975, King Faisal had become one of the most respected leaders in the world. Presidents and kings sought his advice. His name was spoken with admiration from Cairo to Karachi, from Jakarta to Dakar. He had shown that faith and principle could triumph in a world of power and politics. But destiny, as it often does, had one more turn waiting for him, a tragedy that would shake the kingdom and echo through generations. In the last part, we saw King Faisal rise as one of the most powerful and respected leaders of the modern era, a man whose wisdom and courage reshaped the world. But behind his calm strength, destiny was quietly preparing its final test. What followed would not only end the life of a king, it would leave an entire nation in mourning and forever seal his name in history. By the mid-1970s, Saudi Arabia stood transformed. Once a desert kingdom struggling to modernize, it had now become a global power, its oil wealth fueling development and giving it a voice on the world stage. Roads, universities, hospitals, and industries spread across the land. The world looked to Riyadh not as a distant desert capital, but as the heart of a new age of energy and influence. Yet, amid this success, King Faisal remained humble. He still lived simply, often seen eating with ordinary citizens, avoiding grand feasts or displays of wealth. He prayed regularly, read the Quran daily, and reminded his ministers, "This power is a trust, not a prize." To his people, he was more than a ruler, he was a father, a teacher, a symbol of moral leadership. But even the most righteous leaders are not immune to the tragedies of fate. On the morning of March 25, 1975, King Faisal woke early for prayer, as he always did. He spent part of the morning meeting officials, reviewing reports, and preparing for the arrival of a visiting delegation from Kuwait. His mood was calm, his words soft. None around him sensed that this day would become one of the darkest in Saudi history. At the royal palace in Riyadh, ministers and diplomats gathered for an official audience. The atmosphere was formal yet peaceful. Suddenly, a young man entered the room. He was Prince Faisal bin Musaid, the king's own nephew. He had recently returned from abroad after years of study in the United States. The king recognized him and, smiling warmly, gestured for him to approach. "Come, my son," he said, words of affection that would be his last. Without warning, the young prince drew a revolver from under his robe and fired. One bullet struck the king in the head, another in the neck. The room erupted in chaos. Guards rushed forward, seizing the assassin, but it was too late. King Faisal ibn Abdulaziz al-Saud, the builder of a nation, the defender of faith and justice, was gone. News spread like wildfire across the kingdom. People wept in the streets. Radio stations stopped broadcasting music and recited verses from the Quran. Mosques overflowed with mourners. In the cities, in the villages, even in the farthest corners of the desert, people could not believe what had happened. Why? That was the question that haunted everyone. Officially, Prince Faisal bin Musaid was said to have acted alone, possibly out of personal or psychological reasons. Some believed he was angry over the execution of his brother years earlier, others whispered of foreign influence, of political manipulation. But no proof ever fully answered the question. Perhaps it was simply the tragic twist of fate, the kind that history sometimes writes when greatness stands too tall. The nation buried its king with solemn dignity. His funeral was simple, as he had wished. Thousands walked behind his bier, silent except for the prayers that rose into the air. There were no golden caskets, no lavish ceremonies, only humility, as the man himself had lived. Around the Muslim world, grief poured forth. From Cairo to Islamabad, from Jakarta to Rabat, leaders sent messages of condolence. Newspapers called him the King of Faith and Justice, the Voice of Conscience, the Light of Arabia. In the years that followed, his absence was deeply felt. His brothers and successors continued his vision, developing the kingdom's economy, expanding education, and maintaining the unity he had fought so hard to preserve. But none could replace the quiet moral power that had defined his rule. King Faisal's legacy, however, did not die with him. It lived on in the hearts of his people, in the institutions he built, and in the example he set for future generations. He proved that leadership could be guided by faith, that modern progress could coexist with spiritual values, and that even a desert nation could stand proudly among the world's powers without losing its soul. He had faced colonial arrogance, economic manipulation, and political betrayal, and through it all, he never abandoned humility or justice. His words still echo today. Our power is not in wealth or weapons. It is in our faith, our unity, and our justice. In many ways, King Faisal's death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Saudi Arabia we know today, a land of influence, education, and global voice, was born from his vision. And though his life was cut short, his ideals continue to guide his nation's path. Decades later, people still speak of him not just as a ruler, but as a symbol of what leadership can mean when rooted in belief and service. This was the story of King Faisal bin Abdulaziz al-Saud, the reformer, the believer, the king who used faith as his compass and justice as his crown. A man whose life proved that one soul, with courage and conviction, can change the destiny of millions. Previously, we saw the heartbreaking end of King Faisal, a man who transformed the Arabian desert into a thriving modern state. But even after his death, the fire he ignited continued to burn. His dream of unity, education, and Islamic strength did not vanish with him, it passed on to the generations that followed. Now, in Part 6, we explore how Shah Faisal's vision reshaped the destiny of Saudi Arabia and the Muslim world long after his final day. After King Faisal's tragic assassination in 1975, the world stood in silence. Leaders from every continent sent condolences. Western powers called him a moderate visionary, while the Muslim world mourned him as a saint and a soldier of faith. Yet amid the grief, one truth echoed through the heart of Arabia: Faisal's work could not die. It had already become a living structure, built into the foundation of the kingdom itself. His successor, King Khalid bin Abdulaziz, inherited both power and responsibility. King Khalid was a gentle and spiritual man, deeply respectful of Faisal's path. He knew that the oil wealth of the 1970s, now at its peak, had to be used wisely. So he continued what Faisal had started, spreading education, expanding infrastructure, and improving the welfare of the people. Across the kingdom, new schools, universities, hospitals, and roads appeared like stars across the desert night. The oil revenue that Faisal had once used cautiously was now invested massively into development. Riyadh became a capital of the future, modern highways, ministries, cultural centers, and universities rising from the sand. But Faisal's influence was not limited to buildings or projects. It was his philosophy, his deep belief that modernization must walk hand in hand with faith, that became the unspoken constitution of the new Saudi Arabia. In his memory, imams reminded people during Friday prayers that Faisal served Islam before himself, and in classrooms, teachers told young students about the king who feared only Allah. Beyond borders, Faisal's vision for Muslim unity continued to echo through the halls of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, which he had helped establish. Leaders of Muslim nations still quoted his speeches, especially his call for a world where no Muslim feels alone. Even countries far beyond the Arabian Peninsula, Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Egypt, and Morocco, felt his legacy. Scholarships founded in his name helped young Muslims study abroad. Hospitals bore his title. And in cities from Islamabad to Cairo, streets and avenues were named King Faisal Road. In Pakistan, Faisal was particularly loved. He had supported the country during times of need and had helped finance the construction of the Faisal Mosque in Islamabad, one of the most beautiful mosques in the world. Built after his death, it became a symbol of friendship and faith, a white marble masterpiece with sharp, angular minarets that pointed straight toward heaven. When it opened, people said, "King Faisal's soul prays here." Meanwhile, inside Saudi Arabia, his reforms continued to evolve. His emphasis on education for both boys and girls began to bear fruit. Universities expanded, young Saudis went abroad for higher studies and returned with knowledge that fueled the country's progress. Yet the leadership remained careful. Modernity was to be embraced, but not at the cost of identity. That balance, that wisdom, was pure Faisal. Economically, his legacy also guided the kingdom through global changes. The oil embargo he once led had taught the world to respect Saudi power. Now, that power had to be managed. Faisal's successors followed his cautious model, ensuring that the kingdom did not depend blindly on Western promises, but used its wealth to secure independence. Politically, his name became untouchable. Whenever ministers debated new reforms, they would ask, would King Faisal approve? Whenever foreign relations grew tense, they remembered his diplomacy, firm yet respectful, modern yet moral. For the youth born after his death, King Faisal became a legend, a figure spoken of with both pride and sadness. In old black and white videos, they saw a tall man with kind eyes and a calm voice, dressed simply in a white robe and headscarf, speaking words that still sounded timeless. "Faith without action is incomplete," he had said once. "And action without faith is empty." These lines became engraved in history, passed from generation to generation. But as the 1980s approached, the Middle East entered a stormy time. Wars broke out between neighboring nations. The Cold War powers, the US and the Soviet Union, turned the region into a chessboard. Saudi Arabia found itself in a delicate position, a friend of the West, yet a protector of Islamic traditions. This was precisely the kind of challenge Faisal had foreseen. In his time, he had warned that foreign interests will always seek to divide the Muslim world. Now his warning was proving true. But because of the structure he had built, a strong economy, an organized state, and a unified religious voice, Saudi Arabia remained steady while many nations around it fell into chaos. Even decades later, during crises that followed, the Gulf War, the rise of extremism, the Arab Spring, leaders often looked back to Faisal's model of balance. His approach of unity, education, and cautious reform became the secret formula of the kingdom's survival. Yet, beyond politics and power, King Faisal's greatest achievement was something deeper. He gave the Arab and Muslim world a sense of dignity at a time when it had been forgotten. He stood before superpowers and spoke not as a beggar, but as an equal. He proved that a Muslim leader could be both faithful and visionary, both spiritual and strategic. Today, nearly 50 years after his death, his photographs still hang in schools and government buildings. His quotes are still shared on social media. His name appears in documentaries, books, and speeches, a reminder that one man's belief in justice can outlast empires. Every year, people still visit his grave in Riyadh. They leave quietly, without ceremony, whispering prayers of gratitude. And somewhere deep in the sand of Arabia, the story of King Faisal continues, not as a tale of the past, but as a living flame of hope. Because Shah Faisal was not just the king of Saudi Arabia, he was the conscience of a generation, the architect of faith in modern times, and the last great monarch who ruled with both the Quran in his hand and humanity in his heart. In the last part, we saw how the legacy of Shah Faisal, the last great king, lived on beyond his death. His principles of justice, faith, and unity became the foundation of Saudi Arabia's modern identity. But the world did not remain calm. The 1980s and 1990s brought a new age of wars, revolutions, and ideological battles that would test everything Faisal had built. Now, in Part 7, we enter the next chapter of his legacy, the struggle to preserve his vision in a rapidly changing world. The news of King Faisal's assassination had rippled through the hearts of millions, but for those who came after him, it was not just a memory, it was a duty. Every Saudi child who studied his story grew up believing that they had inherited a mission, to continue what he had begun. And that mission was not just to build a nation, but to protect an idea, the idea of a world guided by faith, knowledge, and justice. By the late 1970s, the kingdom was changing fast. Oil wealth had flooded in, transforming deserts into cities, and villages into bustling towns. Skyscrapers began to rise in Riyadh and Jeddah, roads stretched through once empty lands, and airplanes filled the skies above Arabia. But this modernization came with a silent challenge. How could Saudi Arabia remain loyal to Islam while embracing the future? This was exactly the question King Faisal had wrestled with all his life. He believed that progress was a blessing from God, but only if it strengthened, not weakened, the spirit of the people. His successors remembered his words and tried to walk the same line. In 1979, however, a shockwave hit the heart of the kingdom. A group of extremists seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca, claiming that society had strayed from Islam. For 2 weeks, gunfire echoed in the holiest place on earth. It was the most painful event in Saudi history, a moment that shook the entire Muslim world. And though Faisal was gone, his philosophy offered the answer. He had always warned against ignorance disguised as piety, and against faith without wisdom. After the siege ended, the government turned once again to his principles: education, moderation, and unity. New efforts began to strengthen Islamic identity through knowledge, not violence. Schools emphasized understanding, not fanaticism. Scholars and teachers reminded people of what Faisal had preached, that Islam is not extremism, Islam is balance. But just beyond Arabia's borders, chaos was spreading. The Iranian Revolution had overthrown a Western-backed monarchy and replaced it with a theocratic rule. The new regime claimed to speak for all Muslims, something Faisal had opposed in his time, believing that unity should come from cooperation, not control. Saudi Arabia now faced a new ideological challenge: how to defend Sunni leadership without falling into sectarian conflict. Then came the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Once again, the echoes of Faisal's vision were heard. During his lifetime, he had spoken about the importance of defending Muslim lands and supporting oppressed peoples. Now, Saudi Arabia joined with other nations to fund and support Afghan resistance fighters. For many Saudis, it was seen as continuing Faisal's legacy, protecting Islam from foreign domination. The 1980s became a decade of contradictions. On one side, oil prices brought prosperity, highways, and universities. On the other, new ideologies and regional wars threatened stability. Through all this, Faisal's legacy guided leaders like an invisible compass. When advisors debated whether to align too closely with the West or to close the doors of the kingdom, they remembered his advice: take knowledge from wherever it comes, but let your heart stay with God. Culturally, Faisal's impact also flourished. Television networks, radio channels, and newspapers began telling stories of the early kingdom, reminding people of the values that had united them. The King Faisal Foundation, established by his sons, began awarding the King Faisal Prize every year, one of the most prestigious honors in the Muslim world, recognizing excellence in science, literature, and service to Islam. Winners came from all continents: scholars from Egypt, scientists from Pakistan, authors from Indonesia, and doctors from the West. The message was clear: Faisal's vision of blending knowledge and faith was alive. As the Cold War raged on, Saudi Arabia became one of the most influential nations on earth. Western powers sought its oil, while Muslim nations sought its leadership. Faisal's dream of independence, of an Arabia that could speak for itself, was now reality. Yet with power came danger. Internal debates grew louder: some wanted faster modernization, others feared it would corrupt society. In these tense moments, older advisors who had served under Faisal often quoted his timeless phrase: the path of truth is narrow, but it leads to peace. By the early 1990s, the world had changed again. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and war returned to the Gulf. Saudi Arabia faced a test unlike any other. The kingdom allowed Western troops onto its soil to protect the region, a controversial decision that divided opinions. Yet leaders justified it as a necessary evil to preserve stability. They knew that Faisal, too, had made difficult choices when the world was collapsing around him. Throughout this turmoil, one thing never faded: the image of Faisal as the moral father of the nation. Whenever times were dark, his portraits appeared more frequently on walls and in newspapers. His name was invoked in prayers, speeches, and songs. To many Saudis, he was no longer just a king, he was a symbol of what it meant to rule with integrity and faith. In foreign relations, the shadow of Faisal guided Saudi diplomacy. He had taught the importance of balance, being open to the world, but never dependent on it. So the kingdom expanded its ties with Asia and Africa, invested in education abroad, and began sending humanitarian aid to poor countries. Hospitals and schools funded by Saudi Arabia appeared in dozens of nations, each one quietly carrying the torch of Faisal's compassion. The world was changing fast: technology, globalization, new generations. But in Saudi homes, the lessons of Faisal were still repeated at dinner tables: be modern in mind, but pure in heart. Be strong in wealth, but humble before God. By the time the 21st century dawned, his great-grandchildren walked streets lined with skyscrapers, universities, and mosques, all built on his foundations. The world was no longer the one he had known, but his dream of unity and purpose had survived every storm. Faisal had once said, "When the world loses its direction, faith is the compass." And so it remained. His story was no longer just history, it was a living philosophy, guiding a nation still searching for balance between heaven and earth. In the last part, we explored how Shah Faisal's legacy shaped the decades after his death, guiding Saudi Arabia through war, revolution, and rebirth. His vision of faith-driven progress became the compass that helped the kingdom survive storms both within and beyond its borders. But as the world stepped into a new century, new challenges emerged: globalization, technology, and a shifting balance of power. Now, in Part 8, we enter the age where Faisal's dream was tested by the modern world, and where the seeds he planted decades earlier began to bloom in unexpected ways. The sun rose over Riyadh like a golden flame on the horizon. Where once there had been a quiet desert town, there now stood towers of glass and steel, wide highways glistening under the morning light, and call to prayer echoing between skyscrapers. This was the vision Shah Faisal had dreamed of: a nation that embraced progress but never lost its soul. His portrait still hung in offices and homes, eyes steady, as if watching over the transformation he had foreseen. By the dawn of the new millennium, Saudi Arabia stood at a crossroads. The world had become a digital empire, information flowed faster than oil, and the borders of culture had begun to fade. For many nations, this was a time of confusion. But for Saudi Arabia, it was an opportunity, a chance to prove that modernity and faith could coexist. The younger generation of Saudis, children and grandchildren of those who had witnessed Faisal's reign, grew up surrounded by his legacy. In their classrooms, they studied not only science and technology, but also the story of the man who had built the kingdom's moral foundation. Teachers would tell them, "He taught us to learn from the world, but never to lose our heart to it." This balance between old and new became the spirit of a new era. Universities expanded, research centers opened, and thousands of students were sent abroad to learn and return home, a vision Faisal had once spoken about when he said that knowledge was the truest wealth a nation could possess. In the early 2000s, the world changed overnight. The attacks of September 11 shocked humanity, and Saudi Arabia found itself in the center of global scrutiny. Many in the West looked at the kingdom with suspicion, misunderstanding its people and faith. But within Saudi Arabia, the echoes of Faisal's teachings became louder. He had spent his life showing the world that Islam was peace, wisdom, and balance, and that message was now more vital than ever. Leaders, scholars, and citizens began working to restore that image. International conferences were held to promote interfaith dialogue, the very kind of conversation Faisal had envisioned decades earlier when he met popes, presidents, and priests. His voice, though long gone, seemed to speak again through the actions of those who remembered him. If ignorance divides the world, then understanding must unite it. Meanwhile, the kingdom began to diversify. Beyond oil, it invested in education, healthcare, and science. The King Faisal Foundation grew in prestige, honoring men and women who contributed to humanity, from scientists who cured diseases to thinkers who promoted peace. Each award ceremony became not just a celebration of achievement, but a tribute to the man whose belief in knowledge had made it all possible. As decades turned, the Arabian Peninsula, once dismissed as a land of sand, became a center of innovation and diplomacy. Faisal's dream of independence was no longer just political, it had become cultural. Saudi filmmakers began telling stories inspired by heritage, writers explored faith and identity, and architects blended modern design with ancient geometry. It was as if the spirit of the old desert had learned to speak the language of the future. The world watched. Oil still gave the kingdom power, but it was no longer its only gift to the planet. Saudi students returned from abroad as engineers, doctors, artists, and entrepreneurs, each one carrying a spark of the dream Faisal had lit generations earlier. Yet progress always brings its tests. Social changes began to unfold, voices rose asking for more inclusion, for broader opportunities, for the chance to let the kingdom's youth lead the way forward. It was a delicate moment, much like the times Faisal himself had lived through. He had believed in reform, but never revolution, in transformation, but never destruction. The leaders who followed tried to honor that same balance. Step by step, they introduced changes, opening doors for education, for women, for dialogue, all while ensuring that the foundation of faith remained unshaken. It was not easy. Every change met resistance. But Faisal's memory reminded them that courage guided by faith is never wrong. On the global stage, Saudi Arabia took on a new role. It mediated conflicts, sent aid to nations in crisis, and built mosques and schools across continents. This quiet diplomacy, a blend of generosity and strategy, was pure Faisal in spirit. He had always believed that strength should be used not for domination, but for service. One striking moment came in the early 2010s, when international markets trembled and wars scarred neighboring lands. Amid this chaos, Saudi Arabia offered stability. While the world burned in uncertainty, the kingdom became a symbol of continuity, a living example of how a nation rooted in faith could stand firm through every storm. Inside the kingdom, memories of Faisal were kept alive not only by history books, but by the living monuments of his vision, universities bearing his name, research centers funded by his foundation, hospitals serving the poor. His words were etched into marble and memory alike: true power is not in wealth, but in the wisdom to use it. As technology reshaped the human experience, smartphones, satellites, social networks, many feared that tradition would fade away. Yet, in Saudi Arabia, there was a quiet resilience. The call to prayer still echoed above the traffic, the Quran was still read by children before sleep. The modern world had entered, but it had not conquered. That was Faisal's victory, his invisible hand guiding the balance between progress and purpose. International visitors often remarked on the strange harmony they found in Saudi Arabia, a place where futuristic towers stood beside ancient fortresses, where digital screens glowed near centuries-old mosques. They didn't realize that this harmony was not an accident. It was the culmination of an idea born long ago in the heart of a king who dreamed that Islam could lead the modern age, not fear it. And so, Faisal's legacy entered the 21st century like a quiet flame, unseen by many, but illuminating everything. In schools, students recited his story as part of their national pride. In embassies abroad, diplomats quoted his speeches as lessons in humility and strength. In homes, elders told their grandchildren how a king once lived simply, prayed deeply, and changed the fate of nations. As the kingdom prepared for a new vision, one that sought to transform its economy, culture, and global presence, every leader looked back at Faisal's example. He had shown that no dream was too large if guided by conviction. He had proven that a nation could be both modern and moral, rich and righteous. The last years of the second decade of the new century saw Saudi Arabia embracing a new dawn, the kind of dawn Faisal would have welcomed with his quiet smile. A nation united, stronger than ever, facing the future with the same courage that once drove a young prince to face empires and change the world. In the silence of history, Faisal's voice still whispered, "Do not fear progress, as long as your heart remains with God." His story was no longer confined to Saudi Arabia, it had become a parable for the world, that true leadership is not measured by power or wealth, but by vision and virtue. In Part 9, we will journey deeper into how Faisal's ideals continued to shape modern Saudi Arabia's foreign policy, the reawakening of the Arab identity, and the quiet revolution of hearts and minds that carried his name into eternity. As the 1970s approached, King Faisal's vision for Saudi Arabia began to reach its most ambitious and defining stage. The kingdom was transforming rapidly, not only in its economy but in its identity, its politics, and its place on the global stage. King Faisal had already set into motion programs that modernized education, developed healthcare, and brought the oil wealth into the service of his people. But now, a larger challenge stood before him, the growing conflict in the Middle East, especially the Palestinian issue, and the looming threat of Western dominance over Arab interests. Faisal believed that the Arab world had to rise again, united, dignified, and powerful. And in his mind, Saudi Arabia was destined to lead that revival. The events that would soon unfold would test his wisdom, his courage, and his faith. It was the early 1970s, and the Arab world was still reeling from the humiliation of the 1967 Six-Day War, in which Israel had captured vast territories from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Faisal was deeply shaken by the defeat. He believed the Arabs had been divided and betrayed by their own internal rivalries and by the manipulation of Western powers. More than anything, he saw that the Palestinian people had been left stateless, suffering in exile, and forgotten by the world. Faisal made a vow: as long as he ruled, Saudi Arabia would not remain silent. Faisal used his position and the kingdom's growing oil power to become a central figure in the Arab-Israeli conflict. He began to strengthen ties with Egypt's President Anwar Sadat and Syria's Hafez al-Assad. Together, they formed a quiet alliance to restore Arab pride. At the same time, Faisal began to push for the unity of Muslim nations worldwide. In 1969, when arsonists set fire to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, it shocked the entire Muslim world. Faisal immediately called for a summit of Muslim nations, and from that moment, the idea of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, was born. The OIC became a global platform for Muslim solidarity, a vision that Faisal had long dreamed of. He wanted Muslims to see themselves not as divided nations, but as one ummah, a global brotherhood bound by faith. By the early 1970s, Faisal's influence was undeniable. He was respected across the Arab world for his humility, his faith, and his refusal to bow to foreign powers. Yet his most defining moment was yet to come. In 1973, tensions in the Middle East reached a breaking point. Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel on October 6, the holy day of Yom Kippur. The war was fierce, and though Israel initially suffered losses, Western nations, especially the United States, quickly sent massive support to the Israelis. Faisal watched with anger as American planes delivered weapons to Israel, weapons that were being used against his Arab brothers. That night, he made a historic decision that would change the world forever. On October 17, 1973, King Faisal and the Arab oil-producing nations declared an oil embargo on countries supporting Israel. Oil exports to the United States and several Western allies were cut off. The decision sent shockwaves through the global economy. Overnight, oil prices quadrupled, and Western nations plunged into crisis. Gas shortages, inflation, and economic instability followed. The world suddenly realized the immense power of oil, and the political strength of the Arab world under Faisal's leadership. For the first time in modern history, an Arab leader had used economic strategy as a weapon, not war. Faisal's calm yet firm words echoed across the world: "We are not afraid of poverty. We lived on dates and camel milk, and we can go back to them again. But we will not accept humiliation." This single act of defiance made Faisal a hero to millions. Across the Muslim and Arab world, he was hailed as the defender of dignity and justice. In the West, he was both respected and feared. Newspapers called him the king who shook the world. The oil embargo forced the United States and its allies to rethink their policies toward the Middle East. Western leaders were now forced to recognize that the Arabs were no longer pawns on a chessboard, they were players in their own right. But Faisal's success came at a cost. The oil embargo caused deep anger in Western capitals, and his independent stance made powerful enemies. Within his own kingdom, some elites were uneasy. They benefited greatly from the oil wealth and wanted stronger ties with the West. But Faisal's focus was always on faith and principle. He used much of the oil revenue to build schools, hospitals, and universities. He expanded the Islamic University of Medina, established the King Faisal Specialist Hospital, and invested in infrastructure projects across the kingdom. Roads, airports, and power plants began to rise in places where once only sand stretched for miles. Saudi Arabia was being reborn, but Faisal made sure that modernization never meant losing identity. He insisted on preserving Islamic values at the core of every reform. At home, he lived simply, far removed from royal luxury. Visitors often found him eating dates and coffee, sleeping little, and spending hours in prayer. He carried a deep sense of humility that made even his critics admire him. Yet, behind his quiet demeanor, there was an unshakable resolve. He once said, "If my nation wants me to step down, I will. But I will never compromise my faith or my principles." By 1974, Saudi Arabia's wealth had multiplied many times over. But instead of hoarding it, Faisal sought to use it for good. He launched massive aid programs for poorer Muslim countries, providing financial assistance to nations in Africa and Asia. He believed that prosperity should be shared among the Ummah. In his speeches, he often reminded Muslims that their strength lay in unity and justice, not wealth and power. However, his growing influence and his refusal to align blindly with Western powers made him a target of resentment. The CIA and several Western governments kept a close watch on him, worried about his ability to mobilize the Arab world economically and politically. Some even feared that his ideas could inspire a larger movement of independence from Western control. Despite this, Faisal remained calm. He continued to focus on his mission, to make Saudi Arabia a symbol of moral leadership in the Muslim world. But destiny had begun to draw closer. Unseen forces were moving against him, and within the royal family itself, tension was rising. The man who had united a nation, defended his faith, and stood up to the most powerful countries in the world was about to face his most tragic chapter. The world saw him as invincible, a king who commanded oil, faith, and respect. Yet, in the quiet corridors of Riyadh's royal palace, shadows were gathering. The storm that would soon end Faisal's life was not one of nature or war, but of betrayal, a storm from within. Part 10: The Betrayal and Assassination of King Faisal. The year was 1975. Saudi Arabia was at its peak of power, wealthy, respected, and influential across the Arab and Muslim world. King Faisal's oil embargo had redefined global politics, and his vision for Islamic unity had earned him a place in history. Yet behind this success, there were quiet tremors of unrest. Some within the royal family and the political elite believed that Faisal's policies were too rigid, too faith-centered, and too confrontational with the West. They wanted modernization without restriction, wealth without limits, and progress without principle. Faisal, however, stood firm. He believed that wealth was a test, not a privilege. And that faith was the foundation of true success. But as his influence grew abroad, his enemies grew at home. Western powers were deeply frustrated by his oil policies and his refusal to normalize ties with Israel. Faisal's insistence that oil should serve Arab and Muslim causes was seen as a direct challenge to Western economic dominance. CIA reports and diplomatic cables from the time described him as a man too powerful to be ignored. And yet, the threat to Faisal would not come from foreign assassins or political rivals, it would come from within his own bloodline. Prince Faisal bin Musaid, the king's nephew, had just returned from studying in the United States. Those who knew him described him as intelligent but deeply troubled. Years earlier, his brother, Prince Khalid bin Musaid, had been killed by Saudi police during protests against the introduction of television in the kingdom. King Faisal had supported the modernization effort, believing that media could be used for education and progress, not corruption. But for young Prince Faisal, the death of his brother left a wound that never healed. He blamed the government, and by extension, King Faisal himself. As the months passed, the young prince grew more distant, more agitated. Some reports suggested he had been influenced by people outside the kingdom, possibly even manipulated by those who sought to destabilize Saudi Arabia. Western media at the time speculated about foreign involvement, though no conclusive evidence was ever found. What is clear is that on March 25, 1975, the day the kingdom would lose its greatest king, the young prince's rage and confusion found their final outlet. That morning began like any other. King Faisal had a busy schedule, filled with meetings and audiences. He rose early, performed his prayers, and greeted his advisors with his usual calm and humble demeanor. He was preparing to meet a delegation from Kuwait in his royal office. As the guests entered the room, the king welcomed them warmly. His nephew, Prince Faisal bin Musaid, was waiting outside, claiming he wanted to greet his uncle. The guards, recognizing him as a member of the royal family, allowed him through. What happened next would forever change the course of Saudi history. As the young prince entered the room, King Faisal stood up with a smile, arms open, to embrace his nephew. The witnesses later said the king's face showed pure affection. But in an instant, the room was filled with chaos. Prince Faisal pulled out a pistol hidden in his robe and fired 3 shots at point-blank range. One bullet struck the king in the chin, another in the ear, and the third passed through his head. The king collapsed instantly, his white robe stained with blood. The room froze in shock. Guards rushed forward, disarmed the prince, and restrained him. The Kuwaiti delegation screamed in horror. The king's personal attendants tried to lift him, but it was too late. The man who had led a nation with faith and courage took his last breath almost instantly. The news spread across Riyadh like wildfire. Ministers, soldiers, and citizens could not believe what had happened. Many wept openly in the streets. Mosques filled with people praying for the king's soul. Radio and television stations across the Arab world broke their regular programs to announce the tragedy. From Cairo to Islamabad, from Jakarta to Casablanca, the Muslim world fell into mourning. In the West, leaders expressed their shock, but few could grasp the true magnitude of what had been lost. King Faisal's body was taken to his palace, where his sons and brothers gathered in tears. The grief was overwhelming. Prince Saud, the crown prince, was speechless. Prince Abdullah, later to become king himself, wept as he kissed his brother's forehead. The royal family immediately declared that the line of succession would continue peacefully, and that the kingdom would remain united, just as Faisal had wanted. The assassin, Prince Faisal bin Musaid, was quickly arrested and placed under heavy guard. When questioned, he appeared calm but confused. Some reports claimed he said he wanted revenge for his brother's death, others said he didn't know what he had done. Psychologists examined him, and rumors spread that he had been influenced by outside forces. But the court found him guilty of regicide, and on June 18, 1975, he was executed publicly in Riyadh. As for King Faisal, his funeral was one of the largest in the history of the Arab world. He was buried in Al-Oud Cemetery in Riyadh, beside his ancestors, in accordance with Islamic tradition, no grand tomb, no royal monument, only the simple desert soil covering the man who had lived humbly and died a martyr in his people's eyes. In the days that followed, tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. The world recognized that a giant had fallen. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat called him a man of faith and honor who gave dignity to all Arabs. Pakistan's Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto declared a day of mourning, calling Faisal the guardian of the Muslim world. Across the Middle East, people prayed for him, and many named their sons after him in remembrance. But for the people of Saudi Arabia, his death left a void that could not be filled. Under his rule, they had seen their country rise from the sands to become a world power, while never losing its Islamic identity. He had shown that faith and progress could coexist, that a nation could be modern yet moral, powerful yet humble. Even decades later, his legacy continued to guide Saudi Arabia. His reforms in education, healthcare, infrastructure, and religious unity shaped the country's foundation for generations. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, which he had envisioned, still stands today as a symbol of Muslim solidarity. And every year, Saudis remember him not only as a king but as a father, a man of vision, courage, and unwavering belief in justice. Many historians call him the last great king. And perhaps rightly so. He lived not for power or luxury, but for purpose, to uplift his people, to defend his faith, and to restore dignity to a world that had lost it. In his final years, Faisal once said, "I pray that when I die, I will leave behind a nation proud of its faith and respected by the world." And indeed, he did. Part 11, focusing on the legacy of King Faisal and how his vision shaped modern Saudi Arabia after his death. After the assassination of King Faisal in 1975, a heavy silence fell over the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The grief was not only for the loss of a ruler but for the loss of a moral compass, a man whose wisdom and faith had guided the Arab and Muslim worlds through some of the most turbulent years in modern history. In every city, mosque, and household, people spoke his name with reverence. His death was not just a tragedy, it was the end of an era. But even in death, Faisal's influence did not fade. It became a living spirit within the nation, a guiding light for those who would lead after him. Crown Prince Khalid bin Abdulaziz Al Saud ascended the throne as the new king. A man of humility and deep respect for his late brother, King Khalid promised to continue Faisal's vision. His first public address was simple yet powerful. He said, "We have lost a father, a leader, and a hero. But his path remains our path, and his dream remains our duty." This statement reassured a nation shaken by grief and uncertainty. Under King Khalid, Saudi Arabia entered a new phase, a time of expansion built upon Faisal's foundations. The oil wealth that Faisal had so carefully managed began to flow even more abundantly due to the global energy crisis. The revenues transformed the desert kingdom at an unprecedented rate. New roads, hospitals, schools, and universities appeared across the land. The modernization that Faisal had envisioned was now becoming a visible reality. Yet, even amid progress, King Khalid ensured that Faisal's religious and moral principles remained the nation's backbone. Every project, every reform carried the echo of Faisal's guidance. Modernization must never mean westernization. Progress must grow from faith, not replace it. But Faisal's true legacy extended far beyond Saudi Arabia. His dream of uniting the Muslim world under a shared sense of purpose continued to thrive through the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, which he had helped establish. The OIC became a diplomatic bridge among Muslim nations, a forum for addressing common struggles like poverty, education, and political independence. Nations that had once been divided by colonial borders began to find solidarity in Faisal's idea of Islamic unity. Pakistan, Indonesia, Egypt, and Morocco all paid tribute to his vision, describing him as the soul of the Islamic awakening. In the Arab world, Faisal's strong stance during the oil embargo continued to shape economic strategy. He had taught the world that oil was not just a commodity, it was a tool of sovereignty. His famous statement, "Our oil is our weapon," echoed in every meeting room where Arab leaders discussed their collective strength. Western powers, who had once viewed the Arab world as dependent, were now forced to negotiate with respect. The balance of power had shifted, and Faisal's legacy was at the center of it. Within Saudi Arabia, Faisal's educational reforms began to bear fruit. Thousands of students he had sent abroad for higher education returned home as engineers, doctors, teachers, and administrators. They brought back knowledge but remained loyal to their traditions, a perfect reflection of Faisal's philosophy. He had once said, "We must open our minds to knowledge but close our hearts to corruption." His belief that science and faith could coexist laid the groundwork for a new generation of Saudi intellectuals who shaped the country's path in the late 20th century. In the arts and culture sectors, Faisal's quiet encouragement of Islamic scholarship blossomed. Islamic architecture, calligraphy, and historical preservation became part of the nation's pride. Riyadh and Jeddah began to host cultural festivals celebrating both the modern and the traditional. Universities founded under Faisal's guidance expanded research in Islamic law, Arabic literature, and science. Even in urban design, his ideals were visible. Grand mosques stood alongside modern towers, symbolizing harmony between faith and progress. But while his internal legacy strengthened the nation, Faisal's foreign policy vision continued to echo on the world stage. He had long dreamed of a balanced relationship with the West, one based on mutual respect rather than submission. After his death, Western nations began to view Saudi Arabia differently, not as a mere supplier of oil, but as a political power whose influence could shape regional stability. U.S. presidents, European leaders, and Asian diplomats all visited Riyadh to express their respect for the late king and to maintain good relations with his successors. Despite these advancements, the vacuum left by Faisal's absence was felt deeply in Arab politics. His moral authority had been unique. He was both a monarch and a man of the people, both a politician and a scholar. Without his voice, divisions among Arab nations resurfaced. Disagreements over peace with Israel, conflicts in Lebanon, and rivalries among Gulf states began to test the unity he had worked so hard to build. Yet, even amid fragmentation, his name was still invoked as a symbol of strength and integrity. When Arab leaders met in summits, they often quoted Faisal's words about justice, humility, and the duty to protect the oppressed. In the hearts of ordinary Saudis, Faisal became a legend. Schools taught his story, streets, airports, and institutions were named after him. The city of Al-Faisaliyah and the King Faisal Specialist Hospital in Riyadh stood as symbols of his modernizing vision. The King Faisal Foundation, established by his family, carried forward his passion for education and humanitarian work. It began awarding the King Faisal International Prize, often called the Arab Nobel, to scholars and scientists who contributed to Islam, science, and peace, a direct reflection of the late king's ideals. But beyond all achievements, Faisal's greatest gift was his example of leadership. He ruled not with fear but with faith, not through power but through principle. He walked among his people humbly, often refusing luxury and insisting that his palace remain simple. He once said, "If I live in comfort while my people suffer, I have betrayed my duty." It was this humility that made him beloved by his citizens. Historians often draw parallels between King Faisal and the great reformers of history, leaders who appear once in a century to redirect the course of nations. Yet Faisal was not a conqueror or an empire builder. His revolution was one of ideas, moral, social, and spiritual. He showed that Islam could be both timeless and modern, that Arab pride could coexist with global cooperation, and that justice was not weakness but power. By the late 1970s, Saudi Arabia stood tall as one of the wealthiest and most stable nations in the world. And though new kings would rule and new challenges would arise, every Saudi child who grew up hearing Faisal's story learned one simple truth: greatness does not come from the crown, it comes from conviction. And so, his story lived on. His image hung in classrooms, his quotes were recited in sermons, and his name was spoken with reverence in every household. To the world, he was King Faisal, the oil strategist, the diplomat, the visionary. But to his people, he remained Faisal the just, Faisal the brave, Faisal the servant of God. His legacy was not measured in monuments or palaces, but in the hearts he changed and the faith he strengthened. And as Saudi Arabia continued to grow into a modern powerhouse, the spirit of King Faisal continued to whisper through the sands, a reminder that true power lies in service, and true greatness lies in faith. Part 12, where I cover how King Faisal's legacy influenced Saudi Arabia's modernization in the 1980s, 1990s, and how his ideals shaped the next generations of leadership. Years passed after the death of King Faisal, but his legacy refused to fade. It was not confined to history books or speeches, it lived in the pulse of a nation that had found its soul through his vision. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, once a vast desert of tribes and traditions, was now emerging as a global power. Its cities began to rise like mirages of progress. Riyadh expanded into a metropolis of glass and steel, Jeddah became a gateway of trade and culture, and the eastern province glimmered under the prosperity brought by oil. Yet beneath the concrete and technology, the spiritual foundation Faisal had built remained unshaken. His vision had not just modernized the land, it had molded the conscience of its people. The 1980s arrived as a decade of transition. King Khalid, who had carried the torch after Faisal's passing, continued to oversee development with gentleness and humility. Under his reign, the kingdom saw a golden wave of construction. Highways cut through the desert, connecting once isolated villages to thriving cities. Schools opened for boys and girls alike, fulfilling Faisal's long-held dream that education would become the lamp that guided every home. Hospitals and universities flourished, many of them named after the late king. Saudi citizens began to see the fruits of the vision Faisal had planted, a vision that blended faith with modernity, science with morality. But progress brought new challenges. The oil boom, which had once seemed like a blessing, also carried the risk of excess. The flood of wealth transformed lifestyles, and the simplicity Faisal had cherished began to fade in the glitter of luxury. The royal family, scholars, and advisors debated how to preserve Islamic values amid this new abundance. Many remembered Faisal's warning, "Wealth without faith is like rain on sand, it disappears without meaning." His words echoed through the palace halls and the streets of Riyadh. It was a reminder that prosperity must serve purpose, not vanity. When King Khalid passed away in 1982, the throne passed to his half-brother, King Saud bin Abdulaziz. Known for his administrative skill and deep loyalty to Faisal's legacy, King Saud launched a new phase of transformation. He took what Faisal had built and expanded it to meet the needs of a rapidly modernizing nation. Under his rule, the kingdom's oil revenues were channeled into building new universities, airports, and industrial cities. The King Saud Causeway connected Saudi Arabia to Bahrain, a symbolic bridge between nations, much like the diplomatic bridges Faisal had envisioned across the Muslim world. But King Saud also inherited the responsibility of protecting the faith-based identity Faisal had cemented. The 1980s were turbulent years across the Middle East. Revolutions, wars, and ideological conflicts swept through neighboring lands. The Iran-Iraq War, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and political unrest in the Arab world tested the stability of every nation in the region. In this chaos, Saudi Arabia stood as a pillar of balance, a role shaped directly by Faisal's teachings on unity, faith, and diplomacy. The kingdom supported causes that resonated with Faisal's principles, helping Afghan refugees, providing aid to war-torn countries, and continuing to advocate for the Palestinian people. Inside the kingdom, King Saud launched an initiative close to Faisal's heart, the expansion and beautification of the two holy mosques in Mecca and Medina. It was the largest renovation project in Islamic history. The marble courtyards, gold calligraphy, and intricate architecture became a symbol of spiritual renewal. Millions of pilgrims who entered the sacred sites whispered prayers not only for their own souls but for the kings who had made this possible. Many remembered Faisal as the one who had first envisioned Mecca and Medina as global centers of unity, a dream that was now fully realized. Meanwhile, the young generation that Faisal had once sent abroad for education was returning home. Engineers, economists, and doctors, armed with knowledge from Europe and America, began to shape the kingdom's institutions. But unlike many modernizers in other nations, they did not abandon their traditions. They carried their faith proudly, proving Faisal's belief that Islam and progress were not enemies, but allies. Universities that Faisal had once championed, like King Faisal University, became centers of innovation, bridging ancient wisdom with modern science. In international politics, Saudi Arabia continued to honor Faisal's legacy of independence and dignity. While maintaining strong ties with the West, the kingdom refused to compromise its Islamic values or Arab identity. King Fahd adopted the title, custodian of the two holy mosques, signaling that Saudi leadership was not about power but about service, a philosophy Faisal had lived by every day. This gesture resonated deeply with the Muslim world. Leaders from Africa to Asia saw the kingdom not just as a rich nation, but as a spiritual center guided by moral conviction. But the late 1980s also brought moments of darkness. Regional conflicts threatened the stability of the Gulf. In 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the world watched in fear. The Gulf War erupted, a storm of politics, oil, and faith. Saudi Arabia became the focal point of the global coalition to protect its borders and restore peace. American and Allied troops arrived in the desert, sparking debate within the Muslim world. Yet, even in this moment of crisis, Faisal's spirit seemed to guide the kingdom's decisions. The leadership sought peace but prepared for defense, remembering Faisal's lesson: strength is not in weapons, it is in unity, justice, and faith. When the war ended, Saudi Arabia stood resilient. The world economy had shifted, but the kingdom's stability remained firm. In many ways, this endurance was Faisal's true legacy, a political philosophy rooted not in conquest or aggression, but in wisdom and balance. He had shown that power could be exercised through faith, and that leadership meant service, not dominance. Throughout the 1990s, the kingdom continued to expand economically and socially. Massive infrastructure projects reshaped the land. The King Fahd International Airport, the Jubail Industrial City, and numerous universities rose as monuments to progress. Yet, amid modernization, many citizens still quoted Faisal's humble sayings. His photo hung in classrooms and offices, often accompanied by his quote, "Our pride is in Islam, not in wealth, not in power. If we lose our faith, we lose everything." His philosophy had become the heartbeat of the nation. Every decision, from oil policy to education, carried a moral reflection of his wisdom. Even in times of tension, like the global scrutiny over oil dependence, or debates about reform, leaders and scholars turned to Faisal's principles for guidance. He had managed to define what it meant to be a Saudi leader, to balance faith and future, tradition and technology, unity and independence. Outside the kingdom, his legacy inspired countless others. In Pakistan, Turkey, and Malaysia, leaders often spoke of Faisal as the man who proved that Islam could be both spiritual and political strength. His call for Muslim unity had inspired conferences, alliances, and humanitarian projects. Even decades after his death, many nations continue to name streets, schools, and mosques after him, a tribute to the king who had spoken for the voiceless and defended the dignity of the Islamic world. As the 20th century came to a close, Saudi Arabia stood as one of the most influential nations on earth. The seeds Faisal had sown, faith, knowledge, and justice, had grown into the pillars of a thriving society. His dream of a modern, faithful kingdom had survived wars, crises, and generational change. But the story of his influence was far from over. For Faisal's spirit was not a memory, it was a movement. It lived in the teachers who educated new generations, in the engineers who built the future, and in the pilgrims who prayed beneath the stars of Mecca. His life had ended in tragedy, but his message continued to echo through the centuries: serve God, serve your people, and truth will never die. Part 13, The Vision Beyond His Time. As the world entered the early 1970s, Shah Faisal's influence had grown far beyond the borders of Saudi Arabia. He was no longer just the ruler of a kingdom, he was the voice of the Muslim world, a symbol of unity, dignity, and defiance against oppression. His leadership carried a moral gravity that few could match. While other leaders sought power through politics or war, Faisal's strength lay in his conviction, his faith, and his deep belief that Islam could guide nations toward justice and peace. At this time, the Arab world stood at a crossroads. Western powers, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, had immense control over oil prices and global trade. The Muslim nations, rich in natural resources, often found themselves exploited or marginalized. Faisal recognized that the key to independence wasn't in weapons or armies, it was in economic power. He began urging Muslim countries to unite, to use their oil as leverage not for aggression, but for fairness. His vision was simple but revolutionary, that the resources of the Islamic world should serve its people, not foreign powers. This vision led to what became one of the most defining moments of his reign, the 1973 oil embargo. When war broke out between Israel and the Arab nations, Faisal made a bold decision that shocked the world. He declared that Saudi Arabia would cut off oil supplies to nations supporting Israel, primarily the United States and its allies. This was not an act of vengeance, but of principle. For Faisal, it was about justice, about forcing the world to recognize the suffering of the Palestinians and the right of Arab nations to determine their own destiny. The effects were immediate and massive. Oil prices soared, economies trembled, and the balance of power shifted. For the first time, the Western world realized the strength of the Arab nations when they stood united. Faisal became a hero across the Middle East and beyond. Crowds chanted his name in Cairo, Damascus, Islamabad, and even in parts of Africa and Asia. He had proven that dignity and unity could achieve what decades of war could not. But power and principle always attract enemies. Inside Saudi Arabia, not everyone agreed with his policies. Some princes felt he was too strict, too focused on modernization tied with religious discipline. Others feared his growing popularity among Muslims worldwide might threaten the delicate balance within the royal family. Yet Faisal never wavered. He believed his mission was not for fame or wealth, but for the will of God and the future of his people. At home, his reforms continued. He worked tirelessly to modernize the education system while preserving Islamic values. He built schools for boys and girls, expanded healthcare, and introduced new technologies that connected the kingdom to the modern world. But even as modernization progressed, he made sure that the heart of Saudi Arabia remained firmly rooted in faith. He was often heard saying, "Our religion is our constitution. It is the light that guides us through the darkness of the world." Faisal's foreign policy also evolved into one of balance and wisdom. While he stood firmly against injustice, he never sought unnecessary conflict. He maintained respectful relations with the West, despite their differences, and often reminded other Muslim leaders that cooperation was not submission. His diplomacy combined humility with firmness, a rare quality in global politics. In private moments, Faisal often spoke about the future of the Muslim world. He dreamed of a time when Muslim nations would be self-sufficient, when they would trade with each other, educate their people, and solve their disputes through dialogue, not division. He envisioned a grand alliance, a united Islamic bloc, that could serve as a moral compass for the modern age. He often said, "The Muslim world is one body. If one part is in pain, the whole body must feel it." During his travels, Faisal met leaders from around the globe, from Pakistan to Morocco, from Egypt to Indonesia, always spreading his message of unity. In Islamabad, he was received like a brother, and to this day, Pakistan honors his legacy deeply. Faisal funded major development projects, built mosques, and supported Islamic education wherever he went. To many, he was not just a king, but a guardian of the Ummah, the global Muslim community. Yet despite his success, the weight of leadership bore heavily on him. Those close to Faisal noticed how much he had changed since his early days. He had grown quieter, more reflective, as if burdened by the knowledge that his vision was larger than his lifetime. Sometimes he would sit for hours reading the Quran, seeking strength from its verses. "We are all servants," he would say softly. "And one day, every servant must return to his Lord." As 1974 turned into 1975, Faisal seemed to sense that his mission was nearing its end. He accelerated his plans for education, oil development, and regional cooperation. He continued to call for an Islamic summit to strengthen ties between Muslim nations, hoping to create institutions that would last long after he was gone. In those final months, his speeches carried a sense of urgency and calm all at once. In one address, he said, "We must rise above hatred and division. The power of the Muslim world lies not in our wealth, but in our unity, our faith, and our justice." The world listened, some with admiration, some with fear. Western powers respected him, but also worried about his growing influence. Within his kingdom, love for him was deep, but so too were the tensions among those who envied his authority and legacy. Faisal stood at the height of his power, but also on the edge of destiny. The foundations he had laid, for modernization, unity, and moral strength, had transformed Saudi Arabia from a desert kingdom into a global force. Yet, behind his calm smile, there was always the quiet knowledge that great change always demands a price. As the sun set on the desert one evening, Faisal looked toward the horizon, his face solemn, his eyes filled with faith. He whispered to one of his aides, "What matters is not how long we live, but what we leave behind for the generations to come." Those words, spoken in passing, would soon echo through history. The final chapter of Shah Faisal's life, his ultimate test, was about to unfold. And the world would soon witness the tragic end of a man who gave everything for his people, his faith, and his dream of a united, just, and dignified Muslim world. Part 14, The Fall of the Lion of the Desert. It was a bright March morning in 1975, the kind of day when the sun seemed to pour golden light across the sands of Riyadh. The royal palace stood calm and dignified as usual, with ministers, guards, and attendants moving through its corridors in quiet rhythm. But beneath that calm, a storm of destiny was about to unfold, one that would change the history of the Arab world forever. Shah Faisal, the beloved king of Saudi Arabia, had woken early, as he always did. He performed his prayers before dawn, read from the Quran, and spent a few moments in reflection. Those close to him noticed he seemed unusually peaceful that morning, almost serene, as if some invisible burden had finally lifted. His face carried that calm smile that had become his trademark, the smile of a man who trusted God completely, no matter what awaited him. At around 10 o'clock, he arrived at his office in the royal court. It was a day like any other. Ministers awaited his signature, aides carried reports, and the hum of government life filled the air. He was scheduled to meet the Kuwaiti delegation that morning to discuss strengthening ties between their nations. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But somewhere in another corner of the palace, a young man was walking toward the same building, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. His name was Faisal bin Musaid, the king's own nephew, the son of his half-brother, Prince Musaid. He carried within him a storm, one of confusion, pain, and perhaps manipulation. In his hand, concealed beneath his robe, was a small pistol. The story of that young man was tragic. He had lived abroad for several years, studied in America, and had become disillusioned by Western lifestyles and the strict discipline of Saudi tradition. His mother, deeply loved by him, had suffered a terrible loss years earlier when Faisal's security forces had killed her son, Khalid, during a violent protest. Though the act had not been personal, the pain had never left the family. Some say foreign elements had quietly encouraged his resentment, whispering poison into his heart. Others believe he was simply broken by grief and anger. At that moment, none of that mattered. History was about to witness one of its darkest turns. The meeting room was filled with dignitaries when King Faisal entered. As always, he greeted everyone with warmth and humility. "Peace be upon you," he said softly, extending his hand to the Kuwaiti delegation. They stood respectfully, bowing their heads in return. Just as he began to speak, his nephew entered the room. The guards recognized him, of course, he was family. No one stopped him. He approached his uncle, the king, as though seeking a blessing. The room fell silent for a moment. The young man lifted his head, looked into the eyes of the man who had led the nation through its most transformative years, and then, without a word, raised his pistol and fired. The sound shattered the peace of the palace. One bullet struck Faisal in the chin, another in the head. The great king collapsed instantly. Chaos erupted, guards tackled the assassin, ministers screamed, and aides rushed toward their fallen ruler. But it was too late. Shah Faisal, the lion of the desert, the guardian of the faith, the dreamer of unity, was gone. The news spread across Riyadh like wildfire. People ran through the streets weeping. Radios went silent, then crackled with disbelief. In mosques, imams broke down in tears as they announced the tragedy. Across the Muslim world, in Cairo, Karachi, Damascus, and Jakarta, the the news struck like a thunderbolt. The man who had stood for justice, who had united nations and restored dignity to his people, had been struck down by one of his own. In the palace, his brothers and sons gathered around his lifeless body. Prince Abdullah, his half-brother, held his hand and whispered verses from the Quran. His face was pale, his lips trembling. He died as he lived, someone murmured softly, with the name of Allah on his tongue. The assassin, Faisal bin Musaid, was quickly captured. When interrogated, he seemed dazed, detached from reality. Some said he spoke of revenge for his brother's death, others claimed he had been influenced by foreign agencies seeking to destabilize the Arab world. No one could be certain. But the timing, the precision, the symbolism, was too perfect to be coincidence. In the days that followed, Saudi Arabia entered a period of mourning unlike any it had ever known. The royal court declared a national period of grief. Flags were lowered, the streets filled with people in white garments praying for their fallen king. From Mecca to Medina, millions raised their hands in dua, asking Allah to grant mercy to the man who had lived for his cause. The funeral was simple, just as Faisal had wished. Wrapped in white cloth, his body was carried by his brothers and sons to Al-Oud Cemetery in Riyadh. There were no golden caskets, no royal ornaments, only the silent tears of a nation. As his body was laid into the ground, the Imam recited verses from Surah Al-Baqarah, and say not of those who are slain in the way of Allah that they are dead, nay, they are living, but you perceive not. The crowd stood in silence as the last handful of sand was placed over his grave. Some wept openly, others bowed their heads in silent prayer. A great era had ended, and no words could capture the weight of that loss. Around the world, tributes poured in. Leaders from every corner of the globe, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, expressed their grief. Pakistan declared a day of mourning. Egypt's president, Anwar Sadat, called him a martyr of faith and unity. In the streets of Palestine, people held up his pictures, chanting, "Faisal lives forever in our hearts." But beyond the sorrow, there was fear that his death would undo all that he had built. The oil embargo had given the Arab world power, but it also created enemies. His push for Islamic unity had given Muslims pride, but it had unsettled those who profited from their division. Some whispered that his death was not just the act of a troubled nephew, but the result of a far-reaching conspiracy. The truth remains shrouded in mystery. In the palace archives, one of Faisal's final notes was found on his desk, a small piece of paper with his own handwriting. It read, "The believer is not he who lives long, but he who fulfills his duty before God." Those words became his epitaph. The world mourned, but Faisal's vision did not die. His legacy, of faith, justice, and unity, became the foundation upon which the modern Saudi state continued to grow. The new king, Khalid bin Abdulaziz, vowed to honor his brother's mission, saying, "Faisal's light will never fade. He has shown us the path. We must walk it with faith." Even decades later, his image remains sacred in the hearts of millions. To many, he is not just a king, but a symbol of courage, humility, and divine purpose. He was the ruler who bowed before none but God, who spoke truth even to the most powerful, and who dreamed of a world where faith and progress could live side by side. And so, though the assassin's bullet ended his life, it could not silence his voice. His spirit still whispers through the desert winds of Arabia, reminding every generation. Stand for justice, even if you stand alone. Fear none but Allah. Live not for yourself, but for your people. That was Shah Faisal, the last great king.